Hi, I'm Canadian journalist and opinion columnist Adam Zivo, and today we're going to talk about Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine met for bilateral peace talks in Istanbul this week, marking the first time since the spring of 2022 that the two nations have had a direct conversation about the prospect of ending the war. Let's talk about how these peace negotiations initially favored Russia, but thanks to the clever maneuvering of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, eventually became a very powerful symbolic win for Ukraine. These peace negotiations arose last weekend following the May 9th Victory Day parade in Moscow, which is traditionally a celebration of the end of World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Under Putin's rule, Victory Day has become a propaganda extravaganza dedicated to justifying Putin's jingoistic foreign policy. In the weeks before this year's parade, Putin proposed a 3-day ceasefire that coincided with his festivities, which Ukraine quite understandably rejected. In response, Zelenskyy proposed a 30-day ceasefire, which would more equitably benefit both sides, but Russia rejected that option. However, the day after Victory Day, the coalition of the willing, meaning the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland, came to Kyiv, and they found the idea of a 30-day ceasefire quite palatable. Upon concluding their meeting and with the approval of US President Donald Trump, they published a public statement calling for the immediate implementation of a 30-day ceasefire, which was supposed to come into effect this Monday. They threatened that if this ceasefire was not observed, they would implement harsh new comprehensive sanctions. Now, this proposal did not align with Russia's interests because Putin has always maintained that a long-term ceasefire should come after peace negotiations, not before, presumably because this will allow Russia to extract more concessions from Kyiv by maintaining its military advantage. However, it would have been difficult for Putin to explicitly reject this 30-day ceasefire because doing so would undermine one of his main propaganda points, which is that Ukraine, not Moscow, is the primary barrier to peace. What he did instead is propose direct peace talks in Istanbul, and in doing so, he was able to shift the rules of the game back into his favor. He proceeded to ignore the Western-backed ceasefire and continue to bomb Ukraine after it came into effect. Crucially, he framed these new peace talks as being a continuation of the earlier peace talks that had occurred in Istanbul in the spring of 2022. And that's quite telling, because in those earlier talks, Russia was not seeking peace but capitulation. The original demands that Russia presented to Ukraine in the spring of 2022 included a 60 to 70% reduction in Ukraine's pre-war military power, as well as the commitment that Ukraine not enter any military alliances and not host any foreign troops. The sole security guarantee offered to Ukraine during these negotiations was a consortium of security guarantors composed of unspecified countries whose protection was subject to a Russian veto. In effect, that was no protection at all. Ukraine entertained the idea of these terms because it was negotiating from a position of weakness, but the talks collapsed after the discovery of the Bucha massacre just north of Kyiv, rendered continuation morally and politically impossible. By framing the peace talks this week as a continuation of the 2022 Istanbul process, Putin signaled quite clearly that he's still not interested in negotiating a just and lasting peace. Putin continues to maintain that any peace deal that is struck between the Ukrainians must address the root causes of the war, which is code for the establishment of a puppet regime in Kyiv. He also insists that any peace would require Ukraine to abandon its 4 territories, which were annexed by Russia back in late 2022. So that would be Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, even though Russia doesn't fully control those oblasts. Russia's idea of a peace deal still amounts to the hollowing out of Ukrainian sovereignty and the further erosion of Ukrainian land. Obviously, Ukraine's allies were not satisfied with Russia's proposal. They saw it for the scam that it is, and so they decided that they were going to impose sanctions unless the 30-day ceasefire they proposed was followed through. However, Donald Trump quite characteristically blindsided everyone by announcing over the weekend on Truth Social that he supported Putin's solution and that peace talks must happen right away. In doing so, he tied Zelenskyy's hands and made it impossible for him to say no to this shift in venue. However, here's where Zelenskyy did something very intelligent. Russia's initial proposal for these renewed Istanbul peace talks implied that there would be a meeting between a Ukrainian delegation and a Russian delegation. Zelenskyy, though, said that he was going to attend these talks in person, and he challenged Putin to come to Istanbul to have a face-to-face meeting. And this, of course, put Putin in a difficult dilemma. Putin has insisted for years that Zelenskyy is an illegitimate president. So for him to have a one-on-one meeting with Zelenskyy would, of course, undermine that point and legitimize his arch-nemesis. On the other hand, if he were to decline Zelenskyy's challenge and not attend the Istanbul talks, that would validate Western suspicions that these talks are nothing serious and would make Putin look quite weak and uncommitted to peace. Over the course of this week, the Russians apparently dithered and made no clear announcement about whether or not Putin would attend. But then finally, on Wednesday evening, at the very last minute, they confirmed that they would be sending a low-level delegation to the Istanbul talks instead of their president. And so, Putin declined to attend the talks that he himself had proposed. As a result, it has been reported that American and European lawmakers feel confident moving forward with their sanctions packages in response to Putin's refusal to follow through with their proposed 30-day ceasefire. In summary, Putin was almost able to manipulate the situation to his advantage and mire everyone in an illegitimate bad faith peace process, which would have delayed European-led sanctions. However, Zelenskyy was able to salvage the situation by shrewdly challenging Putin to put his money where his mouth is. So that's the basic gist of things. Thanks for listening. I'm Canadian journalist and opinion columnist Adam Zivo, and if you like this video and you want to hear more domestic or international political analysis, please like this video and either follow or subscribe to my content depending on what platform you're watching on. I can't wait to share more stuff with you going forward. It's a pleasure to talk to you.